Although Adventure would eventually become its own series, it was branded as Final Fantasy in both America and Japan. But 2 years earlier, what was at the time believed to be Square's first handheld fantasy offshoot was also developed for the black and white device. It was the original Game Boy's first RPG. Makai Toshi Saga was released in Japan on December 15, 1989. When it journeyed to America in September of 1990, it was renamed Final Fantasy Legend, presumably to capitalize on the popularity of the original NES release America received 2 months earlier. It was directed by Akitoshi Kawazu, who assisted with the game design on Final Fantasy I and II, and was recently one of the executive producers of Final Fantasy XII. Kawazu would also direct Legend's 2 Game Boy sequels and produce or direct the 6 console follow-ups. The series' 7th installment was the first to regain its original franchise name in the US, when it started a 3rd trilogy in 1998 as Saga Frontier. When the Super Famicom follow-up to Legend 3, Romancing Saga, was brought to the PlayStation 2 in 2005, North American gamers began to realize the Legend trio had close to nothing to do with Final Fantasy. In 1994, 1 year after the release of Legend 3, Square released Final Fantasy VI. Despite Square's long and fruitful relationship with Nintendo, 6 was the final installment in the saga to grace Nintendo's consoles for almost a full decade. Nothing with Final Fantasy in the title was ever released for the Nintendo 64. In 2002, the release of the GameCube closed many of the technical gaps that caused Square to jump ship, but its exclusive deal with Sony stood as a roadblock to other platform creators. In order to circumvent these ties, Square helped to create the Game Designer Studio, with none other than Akitoshi Kawazu at the helm, then head of Square's production team too. Kawazu held the majority of the shares, so the Game Designer Studio was able to develop games for Nintendo. Its first and only creation capitalized on the experimental technology running on the Cube's current canon. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was released in Japan at the end of 2003 and in North America early the next year. Kawazu acted as executive producer. Kazuhiko Aoki, who had worked extensively on Final Fantasy IX and had been connected with Final Fantasy since 3, directed the project. The art and characters were designed by Toshiyuki Irahana, who assisted Shuko Murase with 9. Kumi Tanioka, known for her work on Final Fantasy XI and several Chocobo games, composed the whimsical score. The story of Crystal Chronicles was far less linear than the numbered series. The planet was covered in a caustic dark miasma that sapped the life and energy from all it touched. The only force that could repel the miasma was the power of giant mystical crystals that gave life to the world. In order to protect their civilizations, many townships harnessed the crystals to defend themselves. However, the crystal's energy was temporary and constantly needed to be recharged. The only thing capable of restoring power was the vital essence myrrh, which grew within sacred trees scattered across the map. In order to continue the power cycle, the town elders sent out crystal caravans to discover the hidden plants. There, the invaluable essence was extracted and contained in crystal chalices, which were empowered with shards of the Great Crystal in order to protect the heroes from the harsh environment. As part of the caravan from the diverse town of Tipa, you were sent out by Roland, the village elder, and charged with the welfare of the crystal and her people. The caravan would travel for several years, returning after 3 deposits filled the chalice and forced the adventurers to be reunited briefly with their loved ones. You could choose a particular trade when you created your character, with each house excelling in a particular skill. While away, you could maintain communication with your family through a Moogle delivery service. Your folks could send news and even presents related to the family business. Like the original Final Fantasy, the main character in Crystal Chronicles was named by the player. You could choose from 4 stylized races, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. The Clavets were most similar to humans who farmed the fields of Fum. Although small, the Lilties constructed a vast empire of the past built upon the weaponry created in the Catharigian mines. The Selkies were a tribe of fur-wearing nomads that had an unclear past. And lastly, the Ukes, who escaped control of the Liltian Empire by fortifying the city of Shella, formed a sluice that diverted water to some of the more arid regions of the world. Gameplay in Crystal Chronicles was different from many of its predecessors and completely unique to anything else on the market, thanks to the utilization of the GameCube's Game Boy Advance link cable, allowing players to control their characters with the handheld and check its screen for vital stats and available actions. Battles were fast-paced and real-time, similar to combat in Zelda or Mana. Complex advancement systems were abandoned in favor of a more tangible, action-oriented approach that offered fewer options but more manageability of active commands. The first was a basic attack that could be strung together for combos or charged for a range shot. Throughout the various dungeons and battlefields, spheres of Magicite dropped off certain enemies that enabled the use of different classic spells, such as Fire and Life. Depending on the number of command slots available, varied combinations of Magicite were used to create fusion spells, such as Holy or Gravity. Magicite was only specific to the dungeon in which it was found, and would be lost when the task at hand was completed. As dungeons were cleared and bosses were defeated, players could choose from a list of artifacts they had collected that added bonuses to their abilities. Upon completing the dungeon, the player was able to pick one, and the others were lost. Artifacts varied from statistical bonuses to rings, which permitted the casting of certain spells, regardless of what area was being explored. Although Crystal Chronicles had an engaging story and innovative gameplay, its primary lure was multiplayer connectivity. True to GameCube form, Chronicles allowed players to set out with up to 3 of their friends. The addition of extra caravanners added a number of changes and enhancements to the experience, while simultaneously comprising a few technical and financial challenges. In order to engage in multiplayer or cooperative mode, everyone, including Player 1, needed the link cable and a GBA. The setup had been utilized before on Zelda games like Wind Waker and the Four Swords, but with them, the technology was used mostly for additional content. In Crystal Chronicles, it was a necessity. Players could check their inventory, swap out spells, shop, and do other such activities without disturbing the other players. However, the character remained vulnerable at all times. Many questioned if a more intuitive inventory management system would have been better than the complicated and expensive requirements. GBA issues aside, multiplayer successfully added another level of depth to the game. Fusion was no longer available simply by adding additional Magicite to the command list, and players needed to time the execution of certain spells in order to achieve greater effects. Also, impromptu roles were assigned randomly that helped in completing tasks. Each GBA screen displayed various pieces of information, such as a minimap and enemy positions and statistics. This allowed one player to be navigator, leader, chalice carrier, and so on. Communication and teamwork was essential to be as efficient as possible. The storybook overworld map was mostly linear, but many colorful personalities sprung up along the windy path. These included leaders of other caravans, such as Sol Rocked and Amadati, Gertie, a Clavet charlatan, and the mysterious Black Knight. They also reimagined some favorites, such as Stiltskin and Artemisian, the Moogle duo from Final Fantasy IX, as well as the infamous Mog, who helped carry the Crystal Chalice from time to time and willingly volunteered for some extreme makeovers. Although the saga of Crystal Chronicles continued on, the game designers did not. By 2006, and shortly after its merge with Enix, Square acquired the studio, in addition to Taito and a number of other companies. Although the GDS no longer exists, the majority of the creative team that gave birth to Crystal Chronicles, including Kawazu, Idahana, and Tanioka, returned to begin development on 2 new chapters. Ring of Fates is a prequel planned for the DS which expands on the core gameplay of the GameCube original, and follows the story of brother and sister, Yuri and Chelinka. The Chronicles will fill out the Nintendo platform line with the release of its intended sequel, The Crystal Bearers, for the Wii, which will be more of a single-player experience than the other iterations. Adventure was the inception of a franchise, but it was soon rebranded and renamed. Legend was already its own entity, but American Game Boy owners were told a different story. Crystal Chronicles, however, has slowly become an arm of the Final Fantasy tree, rather than an apple that dropped a few feet from it. In April of 2003, Square merged with Enix, and its newly conjoined library of games became an unrivaled force in the role-playing genre. But a couple of years before the unprecedented unity, sometime around the turn of the century, a Square executive and one of the top